Hello, everybody. Welcome to our third and final keynote on our third and final day of the RWL12 conference. We've come a long way. My role here is just as a kind of a moderator to start the session and then help facilitate the Q&A question and answer period after. Please remember, you probably are familiar with this now from some of the paper sessions. Please remember, if you want to ask a question, to type your name in the chat function, just your name, so I can then call on you, and it auto generates a speakers list for me, and I'll call on you in that order to ask your question live to the keynote speaker. You're also welcome to raise your hand. I can add it to the speakers list that way as well. And your reactions are functional, so if you want to do a clap or appreciation icon, you're welcome to use that as well. Okay, well, let me turn to introducing the person who will introduce our special final keynote speaker of the conference. I'm pleased to introduce to you Asmita Bhutani. She's yet another of our shining lights in our graduate studies program, Work and Learning and Social Change here at the University of Toronto. And if you want to learn more about her fascinating research, she's also featured on our Work, Learning and Social Change Emerging Voices online interview series that can be found at a link within the book fair materials that were sent out to all conference goers. And I encourage you to explore that. You'll hear a lot about Asmita's work. For now, though, I'm going to turn it over to Asmita to introduce our keynote speaker. Asmita?
Thank you, Peter. I'm so honored to introduce and welcome Dr. Adia Harvey Wingfield. But before I go on to introduce our amazing speaker and the wonderful many hats she wears, I'd like to preface this conversation with an acknowledgement of the times we live in. Throughout the pandemic, we've all seen the horrors of profit-driven capitalist economies and their reliance upon race and gender for profit. We also continue to witness the crisis-ridden public sector services, especially healthcare and education. Despite dominant political economic systems in places like the US and Canada, claiming to be liberal, democratic, and so-called free market, the freedom and autonomy of all is not guaranteed. Workplace processes are organized on the one hand around related dynamics of unfreedom of workers and division of labor along lines of gender and race, but on the other hand are also constantly challenged by changing economic conditions, technological advances, and social justice movements at large. And Dr. Wingfield brings a wealth of knowledge and experiences to deep dive into these workplace processes, including a critical analysis of the tensions between private and public systems and workplace attempts at justice, such as EDI initiatives, highlighting what these processes mean for and how these impact Black women and men in the workplace. Dr. Wingfield is an award-winning author and a professor of arts and sciences and Vice Dean for Faculty Development and Diversity at Washington University in St. Louis. Her work has been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including Social Problems, Gender and Society, and American Sociological Review. In addition to her academic scholarship, Dr. Wingfield has written for mainstream outlets, including Slate, The Atlantic, Vox, and Harvard Business Review, and is the recipient of the 2018 Public Understanding of Sociology Award from the American Sociology Association. She's written several wonderful books, including No More Invisible Man, Race and Gender in Men's Work, and her most recent book is Flatlining, Race, Work, and Healthcare in the New Economy, insights from which we do hope to hear today. And with that, I turn it over to you, Adia.
Hi, thank you so much for that great introduction. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone here a bit about my research, and I thank you to the organizers for asking me to be a part of this conference and this session. So I'd like to go ahead and do a screen share to talk a bit about some of my work that relates to what we'll be discussing today. So the title of my presentation today is Professional Work in a Post-Racial Era, Black Healthcare Workers in the New Economy. And as Mita mentioned in the introduction, most of my research as an academic has focused on the experiences of Black professional workers in different contexts. I focused on Black workers in the legal field, in engineering and finance, in healthcare, in independent schools, as entrepreneurs. But what I wanted to do with this project was to take a bit of a step back and focus not so much on workers in particular occupational settings, but to think more broadly and expansively about work itself and how it's changed and how institutional structures, cultural dynamics, the economy have changed themselves, and to think more precisely about what those changes mean for Black workers. So in order to ask those questions, it's useful to draw a contrast and a highlight between what work used to be and what work looks like today. So when we look at what work used to be, I think often the comparative analysis that is drawn is to this post-World War II work world. And this is an image that we see a lot of policymakers, politicians, commentators, and media figures harkening back to when they show this era of a picture of work that looks very different from the picture of work that we have today. During this time period of work, employees experienced a lot more job security. This was an era where people were more likely to work for one company for the duration of their careers and to retire from that company with generous benefits. Workers experienced fairly little turnover and transition because, again, they were more likely simply to stick with one company. Benefits were pretty competitive in the sense that people could count on fairly robust healthcare benefits. Retirement benefits, again, were often such that people could retire at a certain age and count on those benefits to see them through their later years. Organizations were also defined by a fairly robust middle management sector in the sense that they were much more hierarchically structured in such a way that a middle management layer was usually present in many organizational spaces between workers and those at the very top. Now, it's also important to point out that this type of model of work also occurred in the context of and in the midst of significant occupational segregation. So these types of jobs and this type of workplace model that I'm describing wasn't available to everyone. This was a work model that was largely available to white, able-bodied men. And it's also important to note that this model of work existed largely, at least in large part, because of a fairly robust public sector that was able to offset the costs of training, credentialing, getting educated, getting the skills training necessary to go into many of these jobs. So we look at this picture of what work used to be. It's this picture of people who could count on fairly stable jobs, certain people who were allowed to count on fairly stable jobs that they could stay with for the duration of their careers, that they could retire from comfortably, and feel pretty comfortable that this work would offer them a relative amount of economic stability, or at least a transition to the middle class if they were people who were able to hold those jobs in the first place. So what does work look like today? Today we get a pretty different picture, and most of the attributes that I described with the previous slide are really no longer present for us. For one thing, workers have experienced a significantly declining amount of unionization across all industries. This is very true in the private sector, true in the public sector as well, although we're likely to see more robust unionization there. Workers also experience far less job security than they have in previous eras. They are much less likely to work for that one company and to spend their career working for that company alone. Workers can experience more autonomy and self-direction and are more likely to pursue jobs in different career fields and different industries that allow them to meet their needs and their interests. Organizations are also a lot flatter. That level of middle management that I described previously is not quite as present as it was in previous eras. And workers have also taken on much more responsibility for their benefits. They are more likely to have to contribute more to insurance, health insurance, to retirement benefits, if they are in jobs that have benefits in the first place, which isn't necessarily a guarantee. But certainly workers are taking on more responsibility for benefits than they have in previous eras. Organizations, also in a departure from previous times, offer more stated support for diversity. They are much more likely today than they were in previous eras to say that diversity is something that they value, something important to them, and something that they want to see present among their workforces. But overall, at large, when we look at the landscape of work in organizations today, we're much more likely to see, compared to previous eras, a frayed contract between organizations and employees. And many researchers have noted that frayed contract has led to more economic and more emotional uncertainty for many workers. So we can think about this as an example of what we would call the new economy. And in the new economy, professional work remains one of few routes to economic security. As these shifts and changes in the economic structure and the culture have changed, professional work can remain one of the routes where people can reasonably rely on some economic security because it benefits from technological advances and the growth of the knowledge economy. And professional work is also largely likely to be the focus of diversity dialogue, where organizations and managers talk a lot about the need for more diversity. What I wanted to do with this presentation and with my research here is to focus on what this new economy means for Black professionals. How do they navigate being in this environment where, as access to stable work has shifted to making professional work one of the few risks to economic security, as professional work becomes the locus and the site for more discussion about the need for diversity, how are Black professionals responding to these changes? How are they dealing with being in the new economy? So there are some existing theories that give us some insights into what we might expect to find here. We know, for example, from the research by George Wilson, Vinnie Rossino, and Matt Huffman, that Black workers are likely to experience significant downward mobility as the public sector privatizes. In other words, as private sector companies are likely to fill in and do work that had historically been the subject to private sector work, that has consequences for Black workers, particularly Black men, who are likely to experience more downward mobility as a consequence of this privatization. Sociologists Sharon Collins and Frank Dobbin have also showed that organizations have largely failed at their efforts to increase diversity, despite a significant amount of talk, time, and money that goes into discussing the importance of diversity. When we look at the top levels of many organizations, that focus is not really reflected. And finally, my colleague here at WashU, Jake Rosenfeld, has shown that declining unionization has served to exacerbate racial wage inequality. We are much more likely to see, as a consequence of declining unionization, more racial wage inequality or exacerbated racial inequality in most industries. So this work gives us into how Black professionals are experiencing work transformation. We know that privatization is causing more downward mobility, that focus on diversity has not necessarily yielded results, and that declining unionization in the new economy has had consequences for racial wage inequality. But I would argue that this work still leaves unanswered questions about how Black professionals are dealing with work transformation. For example, as the public sector becomes increasingly privatized, does that mean that Black workers are more likely to pursue private sector work than public sector, despite the public sector having historically been an area where they could count on fairly robust jobs and some experience of upward mobility? Are Black workers more likely to be skeptical of diversity initiatives, given that they have not necessarily yielded changes at the top levels of organizations? And are they more likely to want to see an increase or improvement in union membership, given the fact that declining unionization has exacerbated racial wage inequality? We largely don't know answers to these questions because we haven't had the research to tell us what to expect. So the core questions that I've tried to talk about in this project are thinking pretty expansively about this new economy and what it means for Blacks doing professional work. As many industries in the new economy become more privatized, more stratified, more unequal, where and how do Black professionals fall? What are their challenges? What are their opportunities? Who are the winners and losers in this new economy when it comes to Black professional workers? In thinking through this question, it struck me that the healthcare industry was actually kind of an ideal site to try to focus on and answer these questions. And I say this because the healthcare industry really exemplifies many of these changes that are happening in the new economy in one particular industry. When we think of the question of privatization, certainly that has been an aspect of how healthcare has changed over the past several decades. And I argue in my research that the healthcare industry has responded to this push towards more privatization by becoming what I call a tiered system of healthcare, where there is a private system where well-off, healthy, responsible patients are able to access private facilities, use private insurance, and get the best care. And there is a public system where there is minimally funded public sector care that's available to everyone else. It's also important to note that when we think about this public and private system emerging, this also emerges in tandem with changes to US racial demographics. So as we see society becoming increasingly racially diverse, we also see a contraction of opportunity, and particularly a contraction of access to care in a broad healthcare system that reaches everyone. As the US has become more racially diverse, we're likely to see more patients of color accessing this public system that's minimally funded than accessing this private system. And it's also important to note that these changes occur as routes to professional work have become less stable. As we have seen, less investment in the public sector and less access to public support for the type of credentialing and training that allows people to move into professional jobs. We've also seen at the same time that professional work and access to these routes to professional work have become less certain in ways that make it harder to access those jobs. So when we think about what this means for healthcare, it creates an environment where there is this tiered system of a public and private system of healthcare, while there's also greater difficulty accessing the private sector jobs, accessing jobs in the healthcare system. And there's also more racial diversity among patients and among people who could potentially be practitioners. So here's just some interesting data to think about where Black professionals are situated and located as providers in the healthcare system. When it comes to physicians, Black workers are only 5% of that physician population. They are also underrepresented as EMTs and paramedics, remain underrepresented as physician assistants and technicians who are as nurses at 10% are slightly at parity with some forms of technical work, particularly as health practitioner support techs. And we start to see Black workers somewhat overrepresented when we move to certain areas of technical work and among licensed practical nurses. But essentially what these data show us rather, are that when we look at areas of healthcare, which again represent the most difficult work to get into, the highest status, most prestigious, well-paying jobs among physician work, this is where we're likely to see Black workers least represented. And we're likely to see representation increase when we look at the technical work, which is lower in the occupational structure. So the core questions that I want to ask today for this presentation and for the remainder of this presentation focus on this work transformation to focus here on this diversity, which is an example of this work transformation, and which is pretty mainstream in medicine and nursing. It's very common if you look at the public statements from many professional organizations, or excuse me, professional associations that represent doctors and represent nurses in various hospital or care facilities. It's really common to see organizational statements saying that diversity is something that matters and that is valuable and that it's critical to have more diversity among these provider populations. What I want to focus on for the remainder of this presentation is how that particular aspect of work transformation has an impact on Black professionals. How do they react to and deal with being in an industry where there, again, is more focus on diversity ideology, even as all these other aspects of work have shifted and changed, have shifted and changed around them. Methodologically, in order to carry out this study, I engaged in intensive semi-structured interviews with 75 healthcare workers. These were doctors, nurses, physician assistants, and technicians. Interviews generally ranged from 1 to 2 hours and covered a wide range of workers' experiences moving into the profession, the challenges they faced, what types of opportunities they saw present for them, and how they made sense of many of the changes that were occurring in the healthcare industry. I was also able to use panel data survey from the American Panel Survey, which is a survey that WashU administers on a quarterly basis to a representative sample of 2,500 adults in the US. And finally, I did field observations in 3 settings. I spent time with a Black male doctor who was an emergency room physician at a public hospital. I spent time with a Black woman, OBGYN, who worked at a research hospital. And I spent time with another Black woman who was a pediatrician in a private practice. So these field observations allowed me to get a sense on the ground of what these workers were experiencing and to try to juxtapose it with the interview data that I was able to gather. So what did I find when I spoke with these workers about how diversity initiatives were impacting them and what they saw, how they felt about these types of initiatives? What I found was that diversity initiatives largely left Black professionals feeling apathetic, indifferent, or even annoyed. And perhaps counterintuitively, I found that generally they weren't really supportive of these types of initiatives. And this wasn't because they didn't believe in diversity or they felt that it wasn't important or didn't matter anymore or anything like that. What I did find was that for many Black workers across the board, diversity efforts did not reflect their racial work experiences. And what those racial work experiences were varied by occupational status and they varied by gender. But the common thread among many of my respondents was the sense that these types of organizational initiatives and this example of how work had changed in ways that were very disconnected from their own personal experiences and made it hard to support these types of initiatives. So I'll begin with my findings about Black doctors. What I found was that Black doctors, when it came to what types of diversity initiatives were present in their workplaces, were mostly subject to cultural competence trainings. And so what this looked like was that in many cases, they might have to complete a webinar or a module where they would be asked questions about how cultural factors might potentially impact the ways that patients were treated. So they might have a question saying, if you have a patient who wears a hijab, should you force that patient to remove it before getting treatment? You should not. If you have a patient who primarily speaks Spanish, should you get an interpreter if you don't speak Spanish? Things like that. But most Black doctors viewed these types of trainings as unnecessary bureaucratic hurdles. They told me that these trainings seemed very disconnected from the ways that they felt that race affected their work. And when I pressed them further to tell me how they did see race affecting their work, they told me that they did not encounter what we might think of as overt, everyday racial aggressions. It wasn't an environment where they came to work every day and dealt with overt challenges where people doubted their competence or expressed hostility or anything like that. Instead, they were a lot more likely to say that race affected them through structural and cultural processes. And notably, I found that with race embedded in these structural avenues, gender became a much more obvious form of overt bias, particularly for Black women doctors. So here's some quotes to that effect. I'll start with a quote from Randy, who's an emergency medicine doctor that I interviewed and spent some time with. And when I asked Randy what his thoughts were about diversity initiatives in his workplace, he stopped and actually rolled his eyes and told me, it's the right idea, but that stuff doesn't mean anything. Nobody takes it seriously. Obviously, I think more diversity is important. It's necessary. But the way they do it, the trainings and modules, it's just one more box to check. They just want quick fixes. Doing the hard work, really changing the profession to get more Black and brown people in here, that's not sexy. So I include this quote from Randy because it really encapsulates what I heard from many Black doctors about this question of diversity initiatives. They, by and large, felt that this format of focusing on diversity in the form of trainings, modules, it just added to doctors' workloads. It took them away from the practice of actually focusing on healthcare and providing care to patients. But it also was very superficially driven in their view by way of the fact that it did not offer systemic approaches to really creating more diversity in the medical profession, particularly among practitioners. Here's another quote from Allison, who is a geneticist. And I include this work from Allison because it underscores the types of experiences that Black doctors described that were unmet by the focus on cultural competence trainings and the types of diversity initiatives that were largely present in their workplaces. When I asked Allison if she could tell me whether or not race impacted her work, and if so, how, she said, it's impacted my work just because my interests are focused more so on health disparities, medically underserved populations, minorities, those who often do not know about genetic resources or genetic services that are available. And I find it difficult to identify mentors or people who are familiar with those populations, people who are also passionate about educating those populations about genetic services or resources. So I have not really had much luck identifying people who are working with those populations who can help me better address some of the needs or some of the disparities that I see. Allison's quote here is really important because it underscores how many Black doctors describe these types of structural processes being a challenge for them along racial lines in their workplaces. For Allison, it wasn't that she came to work every day and faced open, explicit, overt hostility from her colleagues. Rather, the challenges that Allison faced were more structural in nature, in the sense that in the new economy, where access to mobility and changing jobs and having resources in a field is often driven by relationships, networks, mentors, because her focus was on racial health disparities and because of the underrepresentation of Black doctors in the field, she felt it very difficult to find people who could advise her and offer her guidance in terms of where she wanted her work to go. This is much more so a structural challenge than it is an interpersonal one. The challenge wasn't just on here's for Black doctors, it wasn't that they know I'm the owner of him. So he fixed me by getting up and walking out. That was beyond my control. That was his cultural bias that basically put his life on the line. It's extremely rare for me. I think that may have been one of only 2 experiences that I've had in 30-something years of white patients that were negative. So this is an important quote because, again, it underscores how for Black doctors, these upfront explicit experiences with overt racial bias are a relative rarity. They're not things that never happen. Most Black doctors that I spoke to will say, well, there was that one time when this was an issue and this person said this and I didn't really like it, but I wasn't sure how to deal with it. But they also told me, by and large, that is not where my challenges are centralized. I'm more likely to have difficulty accessing mentors who can guide my career. I'm more likely to have difficulty facing this assumption that I don't really have room for mistakes. These are the bigger challenges for me as a Black doctor. And again, these aren't challenges that are reflected by the ways that organizations are focusing on diversity. Now, notably, with these structural challenges around race being more present, this meant that for Black women doctors, the ways that they experienced gender bias in the workplaces did feel that much more overt, significant, and salient. For Black women doctors, while their racial experiences were much more likely to be structural and more built into and embedded into their environment, the challenges that they faced dealing with gender were much more overt, much more consistent, and much more specific. So Aisha, a neonatologist, in explaining this further, told me, I see my coworkers that are males and the race doesn't matter. If you're male, they will call you a doctor. If you're female, they will call you a nurse. but it's regardless of your race. Like I see my white coworkers, even just because they're female, they still call them nurse. If they're male, they're a doctor. If they're female, they're a nurse. But the race doesn't really matter. It's the male versus female. That's more important than the race. So again, I incorporate this quote to underscore how for Black women doctors, these intersections of race and gender mean that for race being a more structural part of their experience, the more interpersonal overt experiences with gender bias take that much more notice and become that much more centralized. But overall, for Black doctors in my sample, they were largely lukewarm and dismissive of the types of diversity initiatives that were present in their workplaces, because those initiatives were not designed to address, nor were they capable of acknowledging the span and the depth of their experiences. I'll turn now to Black nurses, who gave me very different examples. For Black nurses, they often cited the frustration that the institutions where they were employed claimed to be diverse places, but nurses felt that these claims were not reflected in their interactions. And when I pressed them to tell me a little bit more about what their interactions looked like, they routinely described explicitly racist exchanges with their white colleagues, but like Black doctors, they also observed structural processes that disadvantaged Black nurses. And consequently, because Black nurses were more likely to be in this space, where they did experience these overtly racist exchanges with their colleagues and these structural processes as well, and saw institutions not really doing much to address this, they were much more mistrustful of diversity rhetoric due to the different racial realities of their work compared to the doctors with whom they worked. So here's a quote that I include from Stephen, who is an orthopedic nurse. And Stephen's quote is included because it underscores some of the mistrust and skepticism that I heard from many nurses about the disparity between what their organization said that they wanted to achieve in practice. Stephen told me, when you look at the settings, the more people say that they're diverse, the more that they're not diverse. They're diverse on paper because you have to be. But if you're diverse on paper, you ought to be diverse in practice. One cannot go without the other. And when I say that to mean that when you're stating you are a diverse program, your nursing staff should reflect that. I know one school where in the fall of 2011, they admitted 50 students into the nursing program and none of them were African American. So that was not very representative of what their mission is. So Stephen here underscores what I'm describing, what I heard from many nurses, this contradiction between what organizations say they are about versus what they actually do in practice. And that contradiction helped to set the stage for why so many Black nurses were skeptical of and doubtful of the types of diversity initiatives present in their facilities. Here's another quote from Janet. Janet is a pediatric nurse that I spoke with, and she gave some insights into some of the structural challenges that she saw present facing Black nurses. And Janet here describes some of the ways that, again, the profession is changing and what the implications are of those changes for Black individuals interested in moving into the field. She told me, the push is to have all nurses, the entry level, be a Bachelor of Science in Nursing and not community college or diploma programs. So those nurses who do attend community college or diploma programs actually may find that they struggle a little bit more to obtain a job than those with a bachelor's degree. How many Black nurses go to community colleges because the tuition is less expensive? Or maybe it's a little bit easier to get into the program in terms of just the numbers of people that they accept or the feasibility of having a family and going to a community college. So again, Janet is raising a really important point to consider when we think about the context of how the new economy has been changing work. One factor of the new economy has been this increased focus on credentialing and skills and training, particularly in professional jobs. But what Janet is pointing out is that even inadvertently, that focus on increasing professionalism and skills training can perhaps unintentionally have consequences for Black workers interested in the profession. Again, this isn't an individual problem. This is a more structural problem that comes about as a consequence of nursing seeking increased and advanced professionalism. But part of what Janet points out is that even for Black nurses who are very skilled, who are talented, who have a genuine interest in moving into the field, this structural change may adversely impact them due to other considerations that may make it more difficult to pursue the 4-year degree and pursue the Bachelor of Science in nursing program. These types of structural challenges, in her view, can make it more difficult for Black individuals interested in the field to access the profession. But they also represent the types of structural challenges that, again, are not addressed and are not resolved by the types of diversity initiatives that are put forth in these facilities. And finally, here's a quote from Mindy, who is a mother baby nurse. And I include this quote from Mindy because she gives some insights into the types of interpersonal challenges that nurses were much more likely to face than Black doctors described. So when I talked with Mindy about some of the general experiences at her workplace and her feelings about them, she told me, I was just kind of noticing that there was just kind of this demeanor of how dare you be in intensive care because of your race. It never starts out as things that they say right out. they start, some nurses, some white nurses, will kind of not say right out and say it. It's the way they look at you when you notice these subtle differences. But long story short, someone actually said to me, we were talking about after work, getting together, hanging out, and said, oh, you can come to my house, but you have to be carrying a pail and wearing a rag on your head to come to my home. So this example in this quote is a stark difference from what I heard from most of the Black doctors. Whereas Black doctors are more likely to say, as I mentioned before, there was that one time when someone said this inappropriate thing, but my bigger issue is the structural and the cultural challenges that I face in getting into the field. And because diversity initiatives don't address that, it makes it hard for me to support them. Black nurses were more likely to say something like, how much time do we have for this interview? Because just yesterday, something really inappropriate happened and my coworker said something like this. And a few weeks before that, my charge nurse said this also really inappropriate thing. And shortly before that, I had this conversation with my two other colleagues who made these really inappropriate comments. So this is an important distinction between what Black doctors and Black nurses are experiencing. For Black doctors, that one-time experience is a rarity that pales in comparison to the types of structural and cultural challenges that they encounter. For Black nurses, these interpersonal challenges are routine, they are every day, and they usually go overlooked and ignored by colleagues and supervisors. And as a consequence of that, and coupled with the structural challenges that they observe, Black nurses then are a lot less likely to assume best intentions from their institutions, and they are a lot more likely to be skeptical and doubtful of the types of diversity initiatives put forth because they seem to ring hollow, given that institutions don't do much about the types of experiences like these that nurses like Mindy encountered on a pretty regular basis. So I'll turn now to the third group that I studied, who were Black technicians. And when it comes to Black technicians, they ironically were actually the most hopeful about diversity initiatives. And I say this is ironic for a couple of reasons. One, they weren't hopeful about diversity initiatives because they felt that they were directly going to benefit. Black technicians did not see that they were really going to gain much from diversity initiatives that were put into place. And this is supported by research by sociologist Ellen Berry, who argues that diversity rhetoric is rarely applied to lower status workers. It tends to be the province of Black workers, it tends to be the province of professional occupations and industries. So Black technicians were not so hopeful that diversity initiatives put into place were going to have much of an impact on them. They also weren't likely to be in a place where they directly experienced diversity initiatives that were present in these workplaces because these types of initiatives weren't applied to lower status workers. So Black technicians did not think that existing diversity policies were going to do much to address the hostile racial interactions that they had relatively frequently with patients and nurses. There wasn't a sense that diversity initiatives would do much to change their work, but they did believe that these types of initiatives might help nurses and doctors to treat patients of color more effectively. So where Black technicians' hope came from was the sense that even if they weren't going to benefit from diversity initiatives directly, they were happy to see these in place because they felt that these initiatives would be geared toward nurses and doctors who really could benefit from them, and that those nurses and doctors could benefit from being able to treat patients of color better, more comprehensively, and more expansively as a function of being subject to diversity initiatives, even though technicians weren't really dealing with them personally on their own. Here's a quote from Amber, a cardiac monitor technician, discussing why she doesn't feel that these initiatives are going to do much for her. Amber told me, I don't think that it'll impact the work that I do just because of my minimal patient contact that I have. But as far as everyone else, I do believe that it'll impact them. I'm thinking of the nurses and doctors that are being trained. It might make them go a little bit more of the extra mile to make sure everyone is comforted and kind of on the same level. Of course, they always go the extra mile, but now it's just adding another key role. So from Amber's viewpoint, having nurses and doctors get more training and get more information about diversity is a good thing. It doesn't do anything to change her work experiences, but it is a good thing for the broader landscape of the healthcare industry and the implications that this training can have on patient care. And I'll conclude with this quote from Callie, who is a patient care technician. And I include Callie's quote because I think it gives some insights into what Black technicians are experiencing and why they were so unlikely to think that these types of initiatives were going to do much to affect their experiences in the facilities where they worked. Callie told me, okay, so not too long ago, I had this patient and I came to her room to get her baby. It was time to do the baby vitals and to do the PKU on the baby. This is a standard test on newborns. And her family was in, her dad was in. So when I came in, I did her vitals and then I asked her, could I take the baby? And I told her I would be back in about 10 minutes. And her dad started going off because she was handing me the baby. And he was like, what are you doing? And she was like, oh, Dad, please don't start. And he was like, you don't know who she is. She's just coming in here, grabbing the baby, and she could be anyone. Look at her. I looked at him and I'm like, well, here's my badge. My badge had flipped around, so I turned it around. And he was like, that's the problem. They'll let anyone work here. You people are lucky to be here. So again, to reiterate, experiences like this for technicians like Callie, they were commonplace. This wasn't a rarity. This wasn't an unusual occurrence. This was just the thing that happened to Black technicians, similarly to the experiences that many Black nurses shared. But the difference between technicians and nurses is that even though technicians were more likely to experience these types of experiences than, say, doctors, they also felt, they shared nurses' sense that the diversity trainings and initiatives put into place were not necessarily going to have an impact on them and on their work. But technicians were, again, more hopeful because their viewpoint was that if others were being trained in these types of experiences that they had, wouldn't necessarily be present for other patients in the hospital, and that some change would be possible, even if that change wasn't going to impact them directly. So I want to conclude here with a few points. I've argued here that mainstream diversity talk is one example of work transformation in the new economy. That we see in the new economy this shift towards organizations being more open and more free about discussing the importance of diversity and more likely to say that that's something that they value. And this is certainly a change from the types of landscape that we saw 30, 40 years ago, where organizations and industries did not talk openly about the importance of diversity or say that that was something that they necessarily valued or wanted to have. But what I've tried to show here in this presentation, what I hope I've shown in my work, is that what diversity actually means depends very heavily on occupational status, especially if we were talking about Black workers. What diversity often does not do, however, is to address the racial realities that Black professionals face in the new economy. Those racial realities are driven by structural and interpersonal factors. They vary by occupation and they have gendered dimensions, so that Black doctors' racial realities with those of Black nurses. Black nurses' racial realities are not necessarily going to be the same as Black technicians. Those racial realities may change, although structural and interpersonal factors are present. There are gender dimensions that matter in terms of what those racial realities look like. But overall, because the types of diversity initiatives that are put into place rarely deal with the particulars of those racial realities, this particular aspect of work transformation is largely leaving Black professionals. Now, because we're regretting that they invited me to speak, there's actually some in these results. And the reason that I say that is because if we look at the data that Black healthcare specific, detailed, and very expansive feedback about the types of challenges that they are facing in these types of organizational structures. Thus far, they are feeling disengaged because organizations have not met them where they are. But I think that with this information, with more information about the types of challenges and the types of experiences that Black healthcare workers are facing in these industries, for organizations that are genuinely serious about wanting to make changes and wanting to be more reflective of and attuned to the challenges that Black workers are facing, there are opportunities to build from this data to construct organizations and to construct diversity initiatives and imperatives in ways that really reflect these experiences and actually have actual measurable outcomes that are more beneficial for Black workers in these organizational spaces. So I will stop there and thank you all for your time and attention. And I'm happy to take any questions, concerns, or thoughts that people have at this point.
Thank you very much, Adia. That was wonderful. It should start off a very, very good conversation coming up now. And what I'd like to do is call on one of the participants who raised their hand early in the going there, Professor Presha Ramsarup. Can we have you pose your question? We'll try to make sure you are unmuted. Yes. You should be able to speak now. Presha? Oh, she's dropped off our list there. Well, people are thinking a little bit. I'd like to, oh, here's a question somebody just asked. Kieran Merchandani, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you so much, Adia, for such an interesting and informative talk. I have many questions, but I'll just limit myself to a couple, and I know others would like to jump in too. But I guess I wanted you to just reflect a bit. I just wanted to hear about your reflections on where you ended off, your reflections on those, I guess, more radical and systemic approaches to diversity training. There seems to be more and more, I would say, frustration with these traditional approaches to diversity, both expressed by our participants, but also, I suppose, by activists, racialized activists themselves. And so I know that there have been pockets of attempts to approach diversity from more systemic and radical ways. And I wonder if you have any reflections on those approaches and whether you have anything to say in terms of how those are different, and whether those are likely to be different enough to actually make a difference, or more of the same. So that's one of my questions. And the other question is, I really was curious about whether your participants reflected on the different experiences of, I think one of the ways your work is so useful is you highlight the different experiences of different racialized groups. So I was wondering whether they reflected on the relationship, say, between Black healthcare workers and Asian healthcare workers, and whether they saw other racialized groups as collaborators or co-advocates, or in other ways. So I'm just curious about that too.
Yeah, that's a great question. Both of those are great questions. Thank you. So to start with the first one about changes to diversity work and initiatives, yeah, it's so ironic that the diversity industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the steps that many organizations take are ones that have for a long time been documented by researchers not to work, right? I mean, we know that diversity training, it does not work. That's not changing things. It has not been changing things. It's not a viable solution to the types of issues and problems that we find in contemporary workplaces. I will say though, some of my colleagues, Frank Dobbin and Alexandra Caleb, have a book coming out, I believe fall of this year, called Getting to Diversity. And one of the things that's really valuable about their book, in my view, is that they've actually spent a lot of time going to multiple private sector and I think some public sector companies to assess from an evidence-based standpoint what types of initiatives and changes have worked in creating more diversity in spaces that have done it. So they echo the research that shows that diversity trainings by themselves are not useful solutions. They don't really move the needle. They find that it's more important for organizations to rethink and restructure the way that they go about hiring, to think more about bringing in managers as part of solutions to these problems rather than blaming managers, which tends to be implicit in many of the types of trainings relationships and connections with people who are unlike them that they might not necessarily forge in the first place. So there is some work that does talk about how organizations can take a different approach to addressing these issues of diversity that's largely born out of the fact that we know that the steps that many organizations have been taking are not really feasible or not really ones that have been successful. To your second question about whether workers in my study talked about other groups that they saw as what we might call allies or people that they worked with, I did not find that expansive. I didn't find that systematically to be true across the board. Now, that's not necessarily to say that respondents did not identify people in their workplaces that they felt were supporters or who could be helpful. But the structure of the project was such that the respondents were mostly talking more about how they responded to these types of changes in the industry and what those changes meant for them. So I didn't get data that talked about whether they saw specific groups as being more likely to be helpful or to be allies or to be people who worked with them in trying to address these types of issues. I think that a project that focused specifically on that question, though, would get some really interesting answers. And I suspect that there probably are some groups in the workplace, particularly in healthcare, that are potentially useful partners in trying to make these types of changes. But I think it would require a project that focused specifically on that.
Thank you for the question and answer. I'm going to use a little bit of prerogative of the organizers here because I know that Smita, who introduced you, has some questions possibly because she's been looking into your work for some time now. So Smita, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I did. Thank you. So Adia, your analysis today, but also in the papers you published, presents sort of nuance in how racism is perceived and experienced based on one's position, right, in the organizational hierarchies. So I'd be keen to know how you conceptualize the relationship between race and class positions in the way racism is perpetuated in and through the labor market. And then also, what would then that mean for EDI sort of initiatives, which are mostly focused on racial and gender identities, even though they're very unsuccessful in what they're trying to do, but still. So yeah, just wanted to know your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So I think the relationship between race and class comes through a lot in the differences that you see from some of the respondents in terms of how they are experiencing the racial realities of their workplaces, right? It is not a coincidence, in my view, that doctors are the highest status group that I interviewed, and they also are the group that's least likely to experience consistent, or least likely to report consistent experiences with racial bias. I don't think that's solely a function of the status of their work, though. I think that's also related to the way that healthcare and medicine are socially organized, the amount of time that they spend with patients, the fact that if you have insurance, you can actually self-select who you want your healthcare provider to be in ways that are not true if you happen to interact with a technician or a nurse. But I think that that has a lot to do with some of the findings that I show here in terms of the differences between these particular groups. When it comes to what that means for diversity initiatives and how organizations need to think about what types of initiatives they are putting forth, I think that underscores some of what I hear from the technicians, which is how much they are ignored by these types of initiatives in many current institutional and organizational structures. For many of the technicians that I spoke to, like I said, they still were optimistic. They acknowledged by these initiatives. Their work was not going to be affected by it, but they still hoped that there would be some positive outcomes for doctors and nurses who were subject to it. But it still means that without drawing attention specifically to how workers who are in a different position in the organizational structure are affected, we're still having these technicians who are going to work and experiencing things like Callie experienced, where she's referred to as you people and told that she's lucky to have a job that she's perfectly qualified and perfectly trained and very capable of doing, right? So I think what that means is that without organizations explicitly focusing on the experiences of Black workers, not as a monolith, but thinking through where people are differently situated in the organizational structure and what that means in terms of the outcomes and developing solutions that are specifically attuned to those experiences, I think we're likely to continue overlooking the experiences of technicians and experiences of other workers who are at that organizational structure, which I don't really think is to the benefit of organizations. One of the things, just as a quick aside, that I did find, and I talk about this more in the book, is that for many Black women technicians, these experiences with these types of challenges led to a lot of turnover. They were very likely to leave jobs, to pursue other careers. That clearly now, as we're in the middle of a healthcare crisis, is not optimal, right? We don't need healthcare workers leaving because they are being mistreated. And if organizations are not paying attention to and attuned to some of the dynamics that are leading to that push out, that is a huge problem, not just for those organizations, but for the healthcare industry writ large and where we are as a society. So I think it's just really critical to focus on those groups as well, and not just to be blinded by looking at the doctors, the nurses, and those who are the most visible workers in the healthcare industry.
Great, thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the exchange. I have another question. Amani Hidamana, can you unmute?
Yeah, thank you, Adia, for the presentation. There was a slide when you mentioned Black technicians. And then at that particular time, my internet was very spotty, but it was an interesting slide for me, because some people might say, well, Black workers are good in a certain area. They will give an example, like look at the NBA. It's all Black because they do very well. Do you think that in that aspect, for technical aspect, why is that Black people, they do well there, they're not facing racism in that area than in other areas?
Do I think they do well and they face less racism?
Like Black technicians, it seems ironically that they're not facing the same challenges than other Black workers in general.
Okay. Well, I think actually the experiences that I heard from Black technicians kind of counter that, right? There's the slide that you missed may have been the one from the technician who basically tried to do her job and experienced a kind of racially biased experience with the father of a patient that she was interacting with. And that was common for many Black technicians. So I think even in that job, which isn't considered, again, as kind of high status or prestigious of a role as being a doctor or even being a nurse, technicians are still in a position where there's a lot of racial bias that they encounter from patients' families, sometimes from nurses who are considered above them in the organizational hierarchy, and that those biases can make it very difficult for them to do their jobs. Part of what I was just mentioning a moment ago was how many Black women technicians I spoke with who ended up quitting or looking for other career opportunities because of the challenges that they experienced in technical work. So yeah, I think that presents its own challenges that are somewhat different from what nurses and doctors experience, but I don't think that sort of work is kind of a haven or a safe space, for lack of a better term, from experiencing racial bias.
Good, thank you.
Thank you for the question, Amani. If I could, I'm going to slip a question of my own in here. Is that okay? Well, I'm just going to do it, I guess. Yeah, and so I wonder, Adia, if you could speak just a little bit more on the relationship of the dynamics of educational and vocational educational attainment processes as feeding, possibly, this is the question, feeding into and relating, making this picture more and more complex, multi-institutional, if you will. I don't know if I'm making perfect sense to you, but yeah, I was interested in the connection, interinstitutional connection, if you will, between workplaces, organizations, sectors, and vocational certification and entry dynamics that might serve as an additional pinch point of a type.
Yeah, so I talk about this some in a research article that I published based on this data also. This is from a paper called Getting In, Getting Hired, Getting Sideways Looks, that's in the American Sociological Review. And one of the points that I make in that paper is that part of why for Black doctors they become so attuned to the structural challenges that are present for them in their workplaces has to do with the fact that they've experienced these types of challenges across a broad landscape of institutional spaces. So, you know, we know that if you're going to be a doctor, medical school is required, residency is required, it's a lengthy process. And in those spaces, those doctors see institution after institution that is engaging in structural biases in ways that disproportionately impact Black workers. For technicians, for example, who still go through some professional training, their experiences are a bit different. They're less likely to be involved in necessarily hiring colleagues, to be able to see how social networks matter in that process. They are less likely to have gone through the same level and extensive amount of educational background and training that doctors have to go through. So they're less likely to see the types of biases that are present, that are structurally present in those types of spaces. So I think that those questions about credentialing and training and the educational processes that lead to where people end up in these organizational spaces matter, because they can give more insights into the types of structural barriers that are institutionally present across multiple organizations and across multiple spaces for some groups relative to others. And I think that's why for Black technicians, or part of why for Black technicians, when I talk with them about how they make sense of the types of challenges that they face, they're a lot more likely to categorize as being interpersonal dynamics, right? This person is mistreating me. This person doesn't like me. This person is a problem because of whatever. And there's less attention to this broad landscape of structural dynamics that I hear more about from doctors. And I think that's because doctors have more exposure to that than do technicians, for example.
Yeah, and I suppose to expand the one were to expand the database, really, there's a whole bunch of people who never exit, or maybe never enter, that are a perfect addition data set to the, you know, the interinstitutional nature that of the portrait you're painting, for sure. And I guess we could go even further, possibly. I don't want to lose track of questioners here. So if you have a question, just put your name into the chat, but not to lose my train of thought. For lack of a better terminology, the kind of even deeper and broader institutional socialization, institutional in this case, in terms of community, family. There's a standard phrase that was used in one of the opening keynote: if you can't see it, you can't be it. And the kind of envisioning process of people early in their educational attainment careers of this, and the building of educational capital, and also a kind of a, I'll call it a cultural occupational orientation. You know, somebody grows up with, well, some of the people you might be talking about, a trade union member in a, well, maybe not so much manufacturing anymore, but some sort of setting. They see, you know, an aunt, a mother, an uncle, whatever, that does that, and all of a sudden it becomes part of their perceptual consciousness as a cultural socialization. So even deeper or more interinstitutional. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, I think it does make sense. I think that that was something that I heard from many respondents that I spoke to also. For a lot of respondents who went into the healthcare industry, particularly doctors and nurses, but not exclusively doctors and nurses, their pathway in was often that they either knew someone who inspired them early on to go into the field, or they had so many challenges, or they had a family member who had so many challenges with healthcare that they wanted to get into the field to try to make experiences better for people like that family member. So I think that your point is certainly supported by my data about how people move into that type of work.
Okay. Well, I like it when the teacher gives the pupil positive reinforcement. Very good. We're going to stay open to questions if there are a few more. There is a standard phenomenon that happens at the end of a 3-day conference that happens across 21 of 24 time zones for people, that they get a little tuckered out. So we're just going to bear with them a little bit, give them a little bit of time. It's the end of our 3rd day.
No worries.
Yeah. Any final questions for Adia Wingfield? Okay. I'm going to, oh yes, Ismita, sorry. I'm glad you caught me.
I'm sorry, I did put it in the chat. So since we have time, just one last question. It may not be exactly related with your research, but I'd be so keen to know, do you think social movements, especially social justice movements such as BLM and other movements like that, do you think these have an impact on workplace strategies around, or even understanding of the hierarchies around inclusion and exclusion and so on? Is there like a direct relation at all?
That's such a great question. I actually was just talking with someone about this morning, earlier today. So the way that I think about it is this, right? If we go back a couple of years ago to 2020, you know, we all were around then. We remember the events that year and that summer. We started off with COVID. George Floyd was killed, and we had a whole summer where pretty much anytime you looked at the newspaper or the news, there was another story about another industry and systemic racism in that industry. Journalism, media, academia, government, any industry that you could think of, there was a story about how there were systemic problems in that industry, right? And we saw responses to that. We saw corporations saying that they stood against systemic racism and that they blacked out their Instagram squares to show their support, right? We saw politicians wearing Black Lives Matter masks and wearing kente cloth on the floor of Congress and taking a knee. And we saw all of these visible public statements about how it was really critical and important to address and respond to systemic racism from an organizational standpoint. So fast forward 2 years later to 2022, where we are now, what has happened, right? I mean, do we still have that same energy about talking about systemic racism? Have we seen marked and notable changes in organizations and companies where they aren't just blacking out their Instagram squares, but we see, again, representative shifts when it comes to their leadership, their C-suites, their executives? Do we see an end to this glass ceiling at middle level management, where now we see more racial diversity among people who aren't just at entry level workers, or aren't just at mid level occupations, but are actually in leadership roles, right? I personally have not seen that. And that's not to say, you know, I don't know everything about every organization or every industry, but I think it's very telling and very notable that we had this period in time where there was a lot of attention to these types of issues. And then almost immediately that was followed by very significant, very loud and very vocal backlash, right? This anti-critical race theory language that we see in political spaces, in schools and governments, right? this anti-DEI discussion, this idea that critical race theory can be applied to anything that discusses race, even though that is very distinct from the actual concept of critical race theory, which is a theory and a term that has meaning. It's not just this umbrella term that can be applied to anything, right? So yeah, I mean, I think if you take a long view of history, this is kind of what always happens, right? There's always moments where there's attention to and progress around particular issues, and there's always blowback in response to the attention to and acknowledgement of particular issues. Where I think there's still room to see, again, it's been 2 years. I think it's still, I think the question to ask is, in a year from now, in 2 years from now, in 3 years from now, do things look like they did in 2019? Or can we point to marked and notable progress as a consequence of summer 2020? What I can say is that right now in 2022, from the data that I have seen, we have not seen that marked and notable progress, but it has also only been a couple of years, right? And that there's still the at least hypothesis that progress could be underway and it could be changing in ways that we would not necessarily see for another couple of years. But I think it's worth being somewhat skeptical, just because, again, this is part of a process and a pattern that has been part of American history since its inception, right? Whether we're talking about the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction and then the backlash against Reconstruction that led to Jim Crow, or whether we're talking about the mid-1960s and the Civil Rights Movement and the backlash against that, where we saw this entrenchment of kind of these neoconservative ideals and language around reverse racism, and how that was an anti-affirmative action backlash, and how that was supposedly impeding American ideals, right? So I think those things give us reason to be a bit doubtful, but I think we also want to look at the data and see what it shows.
Looking at the data.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. Well, I want to begin to bring this session to a close, but I want to end it because I'm not sure if you're going to have time in your schedule. I think I remember you saying you didn't, Adia, to attend our closing plenary, because I'm going to thank you there. But if you don't attend it, I want to thank you a little bit for your commitment to the RWL conference. People may or may not know that Adia committed to one of the original times we tried to put on the conference, and she stayed with us for all the starts and restarts, and we really appreciate it. Thank you for an excellent presentation today. It's helped broaden our keynote presentation contribution as a whole, and we really appreciate it. So join me in thanking Adia for her keynote presentation, and for the questioners who asked questions, excellent questions that extended the discussion. Thank you, Adia. I wanted to say one quick announcement as the hands are flying by here. Please don't forget, you have a little bit of a break now, but if you have any energy, and if your time zone isn't absolutely causing you to succumb to sleep, please consider joining our closing plenary. It's only 30 minutes long, but you'll get a chance to hear about and honor the best student papers in the session. And you'll also get a chance to hear and, in a sense, honor and thank the people, all the moderators and the people who helped make this conference possible. So I hope to see you there beginning at 3:30, I believe. And again, thank you, Adia. Thank you, Asmita, for the excellent introduction. And thank you to the audience. Thank you very much. Okay, goodbye.